And now we want to turn to the Xi-Biden summit, or perhaps Biden-Xi summit, however you want to look at that. That took place earlier this week, at the beginning part of this week. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by KJ Noh, who is a peace activist, a scholar on the geopolitics of Asia, and also an organizer with Pivot to Peace. KJ, thanks so much for being back with us.
Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you back with us. Obviously, a ton of implications for the world come out of U.S.-China relations, so this is a big meeting. Now, I'll say, KJ, I was looking at this and nothing concrete came out of it, but I was relatively encouraged that it seemed like there was some tamping down of tension. So my first question to you is this: am I being too optimistic in my reading of the Biden-Xi summit being a sign that perhaps things are at least ratcheting down a touch?
You know, I think we all want to be optimistic because the tenor of the dialogue has been so hostile and so, threatening. So clearly, we didn't see the usual rhetorical excess and demonization, which usually precedes and comes right after a meeting. Usually, the Biden administration has had this real Jekyll and Hyde approach. That is to say, it says something incredibly demonizing, and then it goes into the meeting, makes nice, and then right after the meeting, something hostile comes out. We didn't see this Jekyll and Hyde done to the same extent as usual. And the readout from the White House was 17 sentences long. Usually the readouts are about 5 or 6 sentences. So they're almost like Kremlin bunker, near Mirandized statements that let you know that they don't want to share anything that happened. So that was a change, but still there's a large difference in the readouts. The US is mostly boilerplate. The only thing that they mentioned was the one China policy, which they affirmed, but they poisoned that well by mentioning the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances rather than the 3 communiques, which is the real international relationship. That's the real international law that governs that relationship. And on the Chinese side, the Chinese sent out a clear warning. They talked about 3 things that they want. They want peace, respect, cooperation, very commonsensical. But at the same time, they pointed out that the U.S. is playing with fire over Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, so with the issue of Taiwan, a lot of people, or I at least heard this analysis, is that, before the rhetoric around Biden's rhetoric around Taiwan was quite hawkish. On several occasions, he had stated that if China invades Taiwan, we're going to literally militarily defend Taiwan. We recently learned that the U.S. military has had people stationed in Taiwan for at least the last year, training the Taiwanese military. And so then, at this meeting, we hear Biden, toning it down a bit and saying, oh, well, actually, we don't recognize, I think it's that we don't recognize Taiwan. So, I mean, is that more of kind of, as you see it, it sounds like that plays into what you're saying as well as kind of saying something big and then toning it down. But I mean, is that little bit about Taiwan at least perhaps a little bit encouraging, or do you not think it means much?
Well, it's a return to the status quo of strategic ambiguity, essentially, that, the U.S. does not take a position. Although they said that if they said, interestingly, that Taiwan is independent to make a decision about its own independence, which is a little bit of word game going on. But, the 3 communiques between China and the United States recognize there's only one China, that the People's Republic is the legitimate government of China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. This is the backbone of U.S.-China relations. Remember, the Chinese fought the Japanese for decades. I mean, Taiwan was taken away from China in 1895. The Chinese fought the Japanese colonialists for decades, hoping to recover what had been taken away from them. 25 million Chinese perished in this struggle against the Japanese. And then for Taiwan to be taken away arbitrarily by the United States and given to this fascist anti-communist state as a kind of, consolation prize and platform to attack China. That's something that the Chinese haven't consider it. They consider it to be unfinished part of their revolution. The other piece, which is very, very troubling, China considers Taiwan to be part of its core interest. And the reason for that is Taiwan is so close to the Chinese mainland. It's 80 miles away. It's like a pawn which has advanced to the 7th row. And if that pawn coordinates with other pieces, or if it makes one step forward, then you know that the end game is nigh and, the game is over. And so that's why the Chinese are so extremely sensitive about Taiwan. That said, they do not want forcible reunification. They want peaceful reunification. And, that the fact is that probably between 1 and 2 million Taiwanese live, work, or study in China, and about 90% of Taiwanese have family relations in China. So they don't want any kind of escalation. This escalation is pushed by the United States and the quisling administration of Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP in Taiwan right now.
I think one of the elements of this, KJ, that is, very important, I think, in terms of how we understand it. And I think it also speaks to the issue of, the lack of real concrete commitments on the United States side. And I think we could also say this about the COP26 thing, is that in Congress, nothing has really changed. I mean, even if Biden had changed his mind, I think it was the day before this, the Wall Street Journal ran the article about investment houses investing in China and saying that there are people in Congress trying to bring forward legislation to stop that. There's the Schumer legislation. I mean, even if, let's say, Biden did want to turn things around, it seems that everything that's teed up in the U.S. Congress is designed to go the opposite direction and to ratchet up tensions. And a lot of those bills still may pass, actually quite handily.
This is a bipartisan consensus that has been building since the 1990s, when we had, quote unquote, the blue team and all the people who were bashing China. They never went away. They continued. They built their infrastructure and their alliances. And we saw it kind of culminate in 2009, 2011 with air-sea battle, which is the war doctrine against China. And then the pivot to Asia, which was architected by Kurt Campbell, who is currently the Asia czar, the China czar in the Biden administration. It's a bipartisan approach. It has been building for decades. It goes back to the old tropes of yellow peril and, Red Scare. But you're absolutely right. There are currently 500 plus bills in Congress bashing, demonizing, attacking China. I've lost count of them. I stopped counting after several hundred. But all of this is to say there is so much momentum towards escalation and hostility to war with China that even if Biden were to disavow the 16 war hawks that he's brought in from CNAS into his administration, there's still so much legislative momentum, as well as so much hybrid war going on, that it's not easy to turn this ship around.
One thing
KJ...
No, please.
Okay, well, I was just going to ask, when we talk about this new Cold War with China, we think about the last Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union and how much damage that did all around the world. And then when I think about this new Cold War with China, which we're really, I feel like, in the beginning phases of, so far it's been very damaging, of course, for diplomatic relations. It's been damaging in terms of what the U.S. has done to Hong Kong. It's very damaging in terms of what the U.S. is doing around the Taiwan Strait. However, I guess, can you give us an idea of the potential damage that could come as this Cold War escalates? In many ways, that could become a hot war in so many different places around the world.
Well, this is the scenario that I don't want to envisage, but to, cut to the chase, it could very easily result in nuclear war. China has a very, very minimal nuclear deterrent. 200, at maximum 300 nuclear weapons. They're all detached from their launch vehicle. So it has no launch on warning. It doesn't have hair trigger. But the U.S. has the U.S. nuclear force posture and U.S. strategy is to use nuclear weapons if its strategic interests are threatened. And it considers permissible nuclear first strikes. So that's the worst case scenario, and I wouldn't put that off the table. The fact that China has such a small deterrent makes it more likely that it could go nuclear rather than this kind of escalation ladder and give and take. So that's the other piece. But in the immediate and direct effects that we can feel is that, for a long time, since the 90s, the US and China have had their economies intertwined. To a certain extent, they're like conjoined twins. Trump and then Biden, continuing Trump's doctrine, is trying to decouple or separate these conjoined twins. Now, what they forget is that China has the beating heart. And if you separate, guess who has the heart? When I say heart, I'm talking about manufacture. China is, the industrial manufacturing powerhouse of the world. And once we start to disengage with that, then that will create massive effects on the U.S. economy, which we are already seeing in the inflation. We see that because of the Trump tariffs on Chinese goods. Those tariffs have not affected China. We're importing 30% more than we did before the tariffs were imposed. But we are also seeing inflation partly due to the tariffs that U.S. consumers are paying themselves. But, in general, all of this bodes badly in terms of academic cooperation. The global knowledge commons is how we develop knowledge together. That is being decoupled through this academic, researching while Chinese, attacks on Chinese researchers. And so there are so many ways in which cooperation, which would be useful for both countries, is actually creating harm and damage. And I would argue that most of that harm and damage is accruing to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the implications there, and I think that's a really important point, both the implications of cooperation and the implications of, more hostility, and seeing that Biden requested this meeting, to what degree, KJ, do you think that Biden is also messaging not simply to Americans, not simply to China, but also to other nations who, obviously publicly have been growing more concerned about this, and I'm assuming privately have been saying similar things? Do you think that some element of why this meeting happened when it did is designed to tamp down general discontent in the world that is with how aggressive the U.S. has been towards a new Cold War?
I honestly couldn't say if that is the case. Clearly Joe Biden is having domestic issues at home. So he needs to kind of, there's only so much aggression and oppression that can be, manifested at once. The other piece is that, the U.S. is starting to enter into an economic, death spiral right now. Remember in 2008, Hank Paulson went to China and essentially asked the Chinese to save the US's bacon. And the US and the Chinese did that by buying massive amounts of US securities. So there's a kind of pragmatic, ask that the US is trying to make. They're trying to get economic cooperation. They're trying to tamp down in certain areas while maintaining the full court press in other areas as well. So I don't see it as really a change of heart, so much as it is a kind of tactical recalibration while the strategy remains the same, which is to take down China.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, Rania.
No, I was saying it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go
let
ahead,
me clarify
continue,
that.
KJ.
the Pentagon has claimed China is the pacing threat. The U.S. elites, through official, quasi-official sources, state that China is the greatest existential threat to the United States. Eli Ratner says everything must be oriented around competition with China. The U.S.'s explicit kinetic war doctrine, it talks about deep strikes inside the Asian continent, i.e. China. The third and fourth offsets are all about finding a technocratic way to defeat China through war. There's endless information warfare. Biden called, Xi a thug and ran on the platform of being tougher than Trump against China. So, the U.S. hasn't undone or gainsaid any of these statements. It hasn't dialed down its posture. What we see is a kind of tactical maneuvering. And I see that inside the context of the hawks, the China hawks that dominate China discourse and policy inside Biden administrations all come out of CNAS. CNAS is known for the massive catastrophic failure of Afghanistan, which was due to their policy of Cohen, or counterinsurgency. They characterize counterinsurgency as carrots and sticks or armed social work. That is to say, you hand out soccer balls at lunchtime and then you break down and break into houses at dinner time. It's good cop, bad cop, carrots and sticks, hot and cold, Jekyll and Hyde. I think the Chinese are likely to see what the U.S. is doing from that perspective. And you can see from the Chinese press is they're saying, okay, this dialing down is good, but there's still a lot of distrust.
And as there should be. I mean, the U.S. has shown no level of, as you say, they're back and forth. There's no level of consistency here. And then also how they operate around the world. I think it's very clear, from the Iran nuclear deal to many other things that even if they claim to be sincere, even if they sign a deal with you and say we're going to have peace, you never know what's going to happen and how it's going to turn around. Obviously, it's very difficult to predict how any of these things are ever going to turn out, KJ. But I mean, it does feel, especially in the context of, world opinion in the wake of COP26, more and more people wanting to see collaboration and cooperation between the two countries, that the U.S. is sort of, raging against the tide, as it were, of global opinion that wants to see the two nations work together desperately because everyone's lives are at stake.
That's absolutely true. And once again, Chinese have tendered the hand of cooperation. They want win-win cooperation. They want peace. But the U.S. Sees this, in my opinion, as a kind of game of counterinsurgency. What I mean by that, counterinsurgency is not a two-handed game between insurgents and counterinsurgents, but it's a three-handed game where you're trying to undermine or gain legitimacy. And what the U.S. is doing right now, even as it tactically recalibrates with China, is it's constantly waging information warfare to delegitimate China and to build alliances against it. So that's the key dynamic that remains. That's the thing which is the most dangerous. And as long as that remains the case, as long as the information warfare continues, as long as, and we'll see how the Biden administration responds to, whether it will go to the Beijing Olympics or not, or whether it will kind of tar it again as quote unquote the genocide Olympics. We'll see how that goes. But those are some of the key signals. We watch the information warfare that will tell us where we're going.
Well, KJ, really appreciate you, as always, joining us here on the Freedom Side. A lot to sort through on all these issues, but very, very important implications. So as always, we really enjoy having you on, and thanks for giving us some of your time.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
No, of course.